Good morning. I'm Jake Legui. I farm near Fillmore, and I'm the chair of the Saskatchewan Wheat Development Commission. I would like to welcome you all to our Grain Off the Rails webinar this morning. While the ag sector has largely been focused on T words of late, as in Trump, trade, and tariffs, today we're going to be talking about another T word that is severely impacting Canada's ag sector domestically: transportation. Particularly grain rail transportation and the inability of the railways to adequately service grain shipper demand in a timely manner this crop year. These service delays have compounded into backlogs in country, at port terminals, and into significant vessel lineups at Canada's key ports. To provide some more detail on how we got here, where we've seen this before, and what the path forward looks like, I'm pleased to be joined by Mark Hemis, the president of Quorum Corporation. Mark and his team at Quorum are responsible for monitoring Canada's grain handling and transportation system on behalf of Transport Canada and Agriculture Canada. Before I pass things over to Mark, there are a few housekeeping items I would like to note. This webinar is being recorded and can be found on the Sask Wheat website in the days to come. If you have any questions for Mark, we ask that you please use the chat function to type your question, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. I would now like to welcome Mark to get things started.
Thanks a lot, Jake. Just put my presentation up on the screen there. Today I'm going to talk about where we are today. I'm going to start with what's happened this crop year and what the issues that we're facing just this crop year, and then I'm going to get into some of the history behind it and finish off with what we believe to be some of the better solutions and how we address some of the things that we're dealing with going forward. I'm going to start though by telling you about the grain monitoring program in case some of the people here don't know what we do. Essentially, we put out three reports. We do one weekly, we do a monthly report, and then of course an annual report. We've been under contract with federal government since 2001 in our capacity as the grain monitor. We've been gathering data that covers everything about grain handling and transportation in Canada, from the infrastructure, what the volumes are, and the performance is probably what we focus on the most. We measure traffic all the way from the farm gate all to the time that an ocean vessel gets loaded at a port or it's going to a destination in the US or Eastern Canada. We've got lots of data out there, but the way that we put it together basically avoids any kind of commercial sensitivity. While we have very, very detailed data, we aggregate it so that we're not betraying anyone's commercial confidentiality. And we do suggest benchmarks based on historical performance. We have 25 going on 26 years worth of data. It's all available on our website at www.grainmonitor.ca. And if you want to subscribe to the reports, you can go to our website, which is grainmonitor.ca. And there's a tab there that you can subscribe through. We try to maintain a balanced position. We try to behave like Switzerland, but sometimes we got to pick a side, and probably today's presentation is going to do exactly that. But it's going to be backed up by facts and the analysis that we've done. So first of all, and I think you got to set a ground base and where the way that we look at things, and we understand that there are things about the Canadian system that are unique to Canada: the geography, the infrastructure that we have, the way that we handle grain, and the demographics of our country, and the climate that we have to deal with is very unique to Canada. We've got a longer length of haul than anybody else that we compete with in the global market, right up to about 1,100 miles. And the other thing that's very distinct about Canada is that while other countries have other modes of transportation that they would depend on. In Western Canada, we depend 95% on the rail system to move our product to port position or to its ultimate buyer. When you compare this to our competitor countries, they've got a much shorter length of haul and more competitive alternatives by which they're going to move it. And lastly, our dependency on exports is quite a bit different than other countries. 66%, sometimes 70%, depending on how big the production is in any given year, is going to the export market. We grow grain to sell it offshore. Uh, we keep some for our own use, usually about 20 million tons a year, but everything else that we grow, we sell it. That's quite a bit different than other countries where they grow grain for their own use. So that's why the export market is so important to what we do in the grain industry. The other thing is, why should you care? I think it's important to understand that about 27% of the landed price of anything that we sell is going towards logistics. And more than half of that logistical cost is from the rail side. One of the neat things that was there in the wheat board days, and I'm not here to debate the whole wheat board thing again, but one of the nice things that was there from a producer's perspective was when you got your cash ticket, it had a very, very detailed description of where the money was going. You saw what the rail price was, you saw what the fobbing cost was, and you knew what the vessel price might be. But in today's world, you get a basis number. And so a lot of this stuff since 2012 has been kind of hidden from the producer's view. Only a few people who really, really dig into it have an understanding of what their total logistics cost is, and that's fairly significant. And one of the biggest parts of what determines what the logistics is where your farm is or where the elevator is and its distance to its destination. And that determines whether it goes to Thunder Bay or Vancouver or Prince Rupert. And it also depends on what that rail freight cost is. And that becomes a significant part of the issue. Now, when you look at those two big factors in the logistics side, one big part of it is the maritime costs. What it costs to basically pay for a vessel from port to wherever the destination is. And I think that's probably best by looking at the Baltic Dry Index. And if you look at it over the last 20 years, it's actually trending downwards. The last 5 years, we've seen some jumps up and down, but really it's a pretty constant number. And when you compare that to what's happened with the rail freight, year over year, rail costs just continue to climb. And there's part of that really that comes about because they're not in a competitive marketplace. Whereas in the ocean vessel world, there's, a few hundred companies that are vying for the business. That competitive factor really makes a difference in how that price gets fixed. Whereas in the rail business, you've got two railways, and for the better part, they operate as two monopolies. So insofar as this year is concerned, this year was really going well right up until about week 16, right before Christmas, late November. But come late November, everything started to fall apart. You can really see it in the unloads. That purple line, or the lines there, are basically what the 5-year average or 3-year average is, rather. And you can see that both Vancouver and Prince Rupert, which are the dominant ports in that period of the year, right up until, in this case, it was week 32, 2 weeks ago. There's only been about 3 or 4 weeks in there where they actually came up to what the 3-year average is, even though production and the grain supply for this year is a little bit better than what the 3-year average is. So we've got a lot of stuff sitting in bins, and I think probably the producers on the call would know that better than I. Really quickly, taking a look at the Port of Vancouver, week 16 came along and it really started to fall off. Same thing with Prince Rupert. You can see that it's been hit and miss in Prince Rupert. Part of this is about order fulfillment. Now, the Ag Transport Coalition does order fulfillment. We track what the stocks and the vessels are. And when you look at what the stock balance is, and what just really quickly, what this says is that we measure what the stocks are in the country against what the stocks are that are sitting at port. And when the bar is above the line, it basically says that the stocks are in a good position to continue to fill the vessels that are at port. When it starts to fall below the line, we can tell that that stock imbalance is really going to start driving what happens in the port position and when vessels start to wait too long. That's the vessel lineup on the West Coast. And you can see that at one point in time, 4 weeks ago, we were up at 47 vessels on the West Coast. That's unacceptable. Really, the number should be around 15 to 20. And basically the reason is that order fulfillment really started to drag right after week 16, and it's never recovered. And 3 to 4 weeks ago, it probably got worse than it's ever been in the history of tracking this statistic. It went down to right around 30% for both railways. And it's not getting better. And that's problematic. When you can't supply the cars in the country, all that means is that the vessels continue to wait. So we've got a problem. And this is not new to this year. This is something that's been going on for a number of years, and I'll come back to that. You look at the 5-year performance, same set of numbers, the vessel lineups versus the stock balance. Another statistic that we track is the out of car time, and that's the number of hours in a given week where elevators at the ports are ready to accept cars, and that there are cars someplace available, but the railways haven't spotted them. And you can see that when you compare that to the order fulfillment rates in the country, they might pretty much mirror each other. And you go through each one of these periods when the railways order fulfillment rates have dropped, you can see exactly what happens. The vessel lineups start to climb, the out of car time really starts to go out of whack, and the stock balance basically falls apart. And you can see here this last one, that's the present period that we're going through. It's the same thing repeated time and time again. Now, there's a few occasions in here, like for instance, this is when the floods happened in the lower mainland, so you really can't hold that against the railways. This was a labor disruption, but all of these other ones are just stuff happens, and the railways weren't able to recover. And that's another big theme here is that I think everybody understands that things happen like floods, forest fires, etc. The issue really becomes is how quickly does the railway recover? And in some of these cases, it's taken 4 to 5 months before they got everything back in line. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they run things so tight. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. But when you look at in that same period of time, and you're looking for somebody who's responsible, is it the grain companies? But you look at the vessel arrivals when they come to port, and you compare that against strictly the number of cars that they order, you see a very strong correlation. So the grain companies aren't ordering cars willy-nilly. They're ordering cars to serve vessels that are coming to the port. And it really portrays that well in this graph. But when you look at it from the perspective of when the cars are ordered and how well the railways have supplied, the green part shows you in this graph where they've actually supplied the cars on time in the week that they were ordered. But that little pink or tan part is where they delivered cars late. And then the white gaps, they didn't deliver cars at all. And as we get into this later part of the year, you really see it there. It's probably a lot clearer in this when we look through 2023 and 24, 25. You can see what's happened in this crop year is that there's a lot of white space where railways just did not deliver the cars. And, in a case, especially in the last 8 weeks, half of the cars that were actually supplied in the country were supplied late. And that's why we end up with the kind of vessel lineups that we have on the West Coast right now. And the one thing to keep in mind is that when vessels have to wait, after about 10 days, they go in demurrage. And right now, the demurrage rate that they're paying on the West Coast is between $13,000 and $14,000 a day per vessel. So there's some vessels out there right now that are sitting on about $200,000 worth of demurrage each vessel. That's a lot of profit that gets taken out of the pockets of the entire system. The railway doesn't have to pay it, but the grain company ends up having to pay it. And you know where that ends up. It goes back into the basis at some point, some portion of it anyways. So I found it useful in a few other presentations, and I'm going to not dwell on it too much today, but I think it's important to understand the historical part of where we got to on this. And I did this a few weeks ago at a Canadian Crops Conference presentation, and it helped a lot in having people understand why we are at the place where we are today. And it all started back when the Crow's Nest Pass rail freight rate was put in place 120 years ago. It was a deal between the CPR and the federal government that eventually the CN actually got in on it, albeit 20 years later. But there was a nation building perspective to this. They participated in bringing settlers into Western Canada. They sold the lines, but the railways got a guaranteed freight rate for the movement of grain. They got subsidies from the government for constructing a lot of the rail lines, and they had rights of expropriation for buying land that they would subsequently pass on to the producers who immigrated to Canada. And, believe it or not, both railways actually had departments of colonization. So that's how integrated they were into this whole idea of nation building 120 years ago. And that went on for a long time. So basically, it created the foundation of the Western economy, and it gave the railways a foundation on which to grow their business interests. But that no longer exists in the same form today. But they are still viewed by many people, including those in government, as an institution rather than a corporation. And that's important. When you look at it from a perspective of 100 years, going all the way back, or 110 years, all the way back to 1914, they went for a long time on that $5 a ton rate, but very quickly, it really wasn't making them any money. But in the first part, it was. The average rate at the end of 2024, back in August, it was $65.37 a ton. But when you put that in current dollars back in 1914, that was like $96 a ton. So the railways were doing really good. They were making a fair bit of money in terms of where they were at the time. But there was that problem. It started in about 1960, and it really just continued to get worse as they went along. So the railways weren't making any money anymore. So they started hitting on it pretty fast. And I think it's important just to quickly look at that first period of time. Oh, it was really where things became problematic. I kind of got out of sequence here, but Um, we'll just go back to that. That period of time was when the crow rate was ended, and there was a big payout of about $1 billion that went to the farmers in about 1985, I think it was, or so. And they started to bring it up to this point where they put in a maximum scale rate. And as we went through there, we had the Estee Kruger review that came about because of the railway failures. They put in the MRE at that point in time, which was the ability to give the railways the right to set rates as long as they remained within an average price range year over year. They were given what's called the BRCPI, which is like a consumer price index for just the railways in particular, and that's how they were able to increase their rates. The one thing that happened in that later part, though, is that while they did adjust seasonally on the rates for the first 20 years, the last 4 or 5, their rate scales have just jumped all over the place, essentially allowing them to take a lot more money at the beginning of the crop year when demand is higher, and they tail off the rate towards the end. On top of that, the entire government fleet was replaced. The difference is the government doesn't own the cars anymore, the railways do, and they get a break in the rate adjustment that they can make on an annualized basis to pay for those cars. Bottom line is essentially the grain companies and the producers are paying for the cars instead of the government. And we can talk about that if anybody wants to ask the questions. But if you look at the statistics over time, especially in the last 10 years, you can see that railway performance really isn't getting better. Matter of fact, in the last 10 years, what we've seen is the car cycle times, which is what's displayed in that chart there, are getting longer. That's not good. And on top of that, the variability in which they deliver those cars to the port locations is increasing. In other words, if the average loaded transit time is, say, 5 days, their variability is actually plus or minus 35%. And it's really hard for anybody to try and plan on that kind of variability. The other thing is, when you look at this is the 23-24 crop year, they put out a plan as to what they're going to offer as capacity at the beginning of every crop year. But it's very rare for them to actually even make it's very rare for them to actually make their plan. So the orange lines here are what the plan says that they're going to supply, and the blue lines is what they actually do supply. And on top of that, you've got a line there that shows what their order fulfillment is. And order fulfillment is a measure of demand. There's only about 4 or 5 months in this period of time where they actually met the demand of the market. And especially in this period of time where they really, really stunk. But you can see that over time, we've seen an increase in the total grain supply over the last 20, 25 years of about 3% a year. Now, we had that in 2021, we had the drought. And basically, what we see when we look back, like, say, 50 or 60 years, the 2 years after the drought really is a recovery period. And by the time we get to the third or fourth year after a drought, it just starts to climb again. So I have no doubt that over the next, 10 years, that 3% a year is just going to continue right on. So yeah, we're growing more grain. The demand for moving it is greater, but we're not really seeing that same kind of performance on the rail side. On top of that, another measure that we take is how does the time in port for the vessels change when car velocity uh, decreases. And what we found is that the slower the railways move, the longer vessels wait at port. And there's a strong correlation. And I know this is a complex graph, but basically what it says is that this is the faster it goes, and this is the number of days that vessels wait in port. So when we have a period of time where the average velocity is 150 miles a day, you can see this grouping here that says that it sits in port longer. But really the bottom line is in this, is that the worse that railways perform, uh, the higher the length of time vessels wait in port. And I've got a little saying is that whenever the railways sneeze, the rest of us get a cold or the flu. And that's pretty much been the practice over the last 10 to 15 years. So the problem really is an inconsistency of rail service. And how do you deal with that? It's simple, and it's not really simple. It's a pretty complicated issue. Matter of fact, over the last 100 years, there's been about 37 commissions of inquiry or investigations and multiple lawsuits against the railways. And really, we've been talking about the same problem on and on and on through that period of time. And it's not really changed a lot. I think the first point to everybody to keep in mind is that railways aren't institutions, they're corporate entities, and they're accountable to their shareholders. They're not accountable to the government or the shippers or grain farmers. They report to the shareholders. And their focus is on shareholder value, their operating efficiency, the management of resources, and their use of assets. And the idea is that they don't like to have anything sitting idle ever. And that's a tough pill. I know for producers who spend, $1 million on a combine that they use 3 or 4 weeks a year. But railroads don't like to see locomotives sitting. They don't like to see crews sitting. So they manage everything really, really tight. So that when things start to fall apart, whether it's cold weather, whether it's some mistake that they made, whether the crews just didn't show up for work that day, they don't have the capacity within their operations to recover very fast. And that's why when something happens, such as a wildfire or a flood or even cold weather, it takes them weeks and weeks and sometimes months to recover. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves in the binds that we're in. And that really is what the problem is. But to kind of double down on that, from a railway's perspective, answerable to its shareholders, having idle capacity is costly. It costs them money. Doesn't mean that they wouldn't still make money, but it's not optimizing their profitability. So that's where we have this kind of butting of heads. For instance, operating ratios at CN and CPKC are probably at the top end of the better of the group, and they're probably going to be tracking to be in the 50s for this year. So from the perspective of the shareholder, they're doing pretty good. From the perspective of the shipper, maybe not. So we should be monitoring this a lot better than we are today, and we are. The Grain Monitor, the group that I have and our sister company who does the work for the Ag Transport Coalition programs are there. I think probably the grain industry, out of all the market sectors that we deal with, are probably better than anybody else in tracking it. But I think it's important to remember that when you look at the total body of workload that the railways have, the grain industry only represents 20%. that other 80%, there are some groups that are working towards something that looks like what we do in the grain industry, but insofar as monitoring is concerned, we're way ahead of the pack, but we're only 20%. And in order to provide any kind of um, uh, support to any kind of regulatory change that might benefit the change in railway attitude or performance, we need to have a greater group of people dealing with providing the kind of data that we do. Otherwise, and I've heard this comment back from a number of people, both railways and government. Sounds like the grain company is just whining, or the grain industry is just whining again, even though it's really well supported by the data. So I think probably part of the solution is getting other market sectors on board with doing better performance measurements, statistics, basically supporting what the grain industry does going forward. We have to stop using anecdotal evidence because that way, basically, when you go in with anecdotes, they basically say, well, back that up. And if there's no backup, you can't. In the grain industry, we certainly can. But the other 80%, maybe not. Now, one of the greatest experiences that demonstrates this is when the CTA first time and only time they used their own motion powers back in 2018. They had a commission of inquiry, sort of, that was supported by the CTA, and did it in Vancouver. And as it was told to me by somebody in another industry, well, everybody, the grain industry showed up. They had data, they supported their arguments, they had facts. Everybody else brought lawyers. And that just doesn't carry the day. So, and the other thing that we need is probably greater research in what we do. And it has to expand just beyond what the grain industry, it has to cover everything. Basically, again, support that says that if you change things, these are going to be the benefits. I think we all know what the benefits are going to be, but I think it has to be proven. You need facts supported with data to convince both the government and the railways of the systemic problems. Because what we need in the industry, not just grain, everybody, is more redundancy and resiliency of the railways so that when a problem does arise, they can recover quickly. It's going to save a lot of money in the whole totality of the system. Goals are to make an increased net gross domestic product for Canada and overall productivity. I think I have a theory that we would probably see more investment into growing grain, increasing yields, if we were convinced that we wouldn't have any problem moving it into the marketplace. But I think one constraint is that maybe, and I think there's probably people out there, why would I grow it, or why would I try to sell it if I don't have the confidence that it's going to actually get moved? And I think that's problem. And I think we can make the grain supply chain the most reliable in the world, because right now we're not. I think our reliability really has an effect on how a grain company merchandiser is able to sell the grain. I think there's probably some of them who have to make special deals because they know that the confidence in us being able to deliver consistently and on time doesn't exist anymore. And that's a problem. And I think that has to be dealt with. I think Jake, I'll stop at that point, and maybe we can have a discussion and answer some questions that people in the audience have.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. We do have a couple of questions that have come in so far. The first one just says it's great information, much appreciated, and totally agree with your last point. Do the other sectors have a need or pain point to compel them to start tracking and sharing the data to shore up the other 80%?
Some of them do. The Western Canada Shippers Coalition, which is a coalition of different market sectors, forest products, coal, potash, and it includes the grain industry. Look at the grain industry with a fair bit of envy. One of the issues that they have is, I think, because this started as a government initiative, while there was reluctance on the part of the grain industry to start with, and I can speak from our experience, it takes a lot of time for them to have trust in releasing any of their data to have a consolidated measurement program. We ran into that 25 years ago when we started the program. A lot of people, they were very skeptical about releasing any of their data. Once we earned the trust, we were able to move forward. The second part of it is that, and I know that the ATC still has a little bit of pushback on this. When the industry has to fund any kind of initiative like this, they become skeptical as well. They're worried about commercial confidentiality, that sort of thing. And I know that the other market sectors, they have a little bit of that as well. Just trying to give them the impetus to move forward and see the benefits and what happens when they do this type of exercise really is helpful.
Great, thank you. A few other questions here. Someone mentions only 20% of revenue, but how dependent is the whole system for viability on the commodity sector? For example, volume ratio of traffic that supports the overall network.
I think without grain, they'd be in trouble. And you really see that if you go back to the drought year, 2021, both the revenues of the railways really dropped, and so did their profitability. All of a sudden, production comes back and they're doing great. So, because grain is one of their biggest commodity groups, it really holds a lot of influence. But the counter to that is that when you look at the industry itself, it's basically divided north-south. CN has the north, CP has the south. So their market power over the grain industry is phenomenal. On top of which, because 95% of all grain has got to move to destination by rail, as Hunter Harrison actually said out loud at a Wall Street conference, well, grain really doesn't matter insofar as performance is concerned, because if we don't move it this week or next month, we can move it 2 or 3 months from now because it's not going anywhere if we don't move it. So there's that part that has to be dealt with. So we were, as an industry, the grain industry is very beholden to the grain industry, and that because there is no hard competitive alternative for a lot of origins, that's the way the system works.
Thank you for that. Mark, what other factors are contributing to the poor railway performance? Port inefficiencies, inability to load vessels in the rain, anything else?
That's an interesting one. Insofar as what contributes to it, certainly things like floods and forest fires have an effect. Basically, there are issues within the railway themselves. I do have some sympathy for the railways, because a couple of years ago there was a fairly significant change in the Labor Act, which didn't get a lot of publicity, but it really had an effect on railways. Now, I'm not saying feel sorry for them, but they were hit with a change in the Labor Act that allowed running trades, the locomotive engineers and the conductors, a greater amount of rest in between the runs that they made, which meant that both railways had to basically increase the number of people that they had working for them. They had to expand their staff ranks in order to make up for that change. Secondly, there was also a change that was made that gave greater number of sick days in the conditions by which they could take those sick days. So two things happened. They had to increase the number of people that they hired and trained, and it takes about 6 to 8 months to create a conductor from the time that they hire on. And they've had a hard time trying to get people convinced that they should go to work for the railway, even though their starting salary is around $70,000 a year. There's a lot of people who don't want to work outside. They don't want to work in the kind of 24/7 environment that you work at when you're with a railroad. So they've had a hard time both in retaining new hires and finding ones who want to work under those conditions. The second issue that they've had is because of the new rest rules or the new sick leave rules or sick time rules, a lot of people will just phone up and say, it's too cold for me to go to work today. Or they decided that they want to take a long weekend, that sort of thing. And that's really had an effect on them, which means that they've just got to increase their staff levels. And I think inside the railways, there is this real tug of war where they say, well, we don't want to hire too many because we don't want to have people sitting around, but we need to have these people in order to recover. And that's the situation that we're in today. I'm going to talk really, I put some slides together about loading in the rain because I think it's important. And if you'll let me share this once again, bear with me a second. This is another graph, but bear with me. It's a busy graph, but basically what it's along the bottom of this.
I don't think you're sharing your screen, Mark. There we go.
Okay, along the bottom of this graph, it basically shows what the intensity of the rain is. And along this axis of the graph is how many tons are loaded. So if there's no rain, and out of the, I think there was 3,000 days in here, or about 1,559 of them, there was no rain. But the greater the intensity of rain basically shows how much gets loaded. And bottom line is that 72% on average of all of the movement that goes through the Port of Vancouver loading to vessels is affected by rain. So basically loading vessels, the biggest problem that they have is when it rains. And it rains probably about 40% of the time. Now, insofar as how it affects the unloading of rail cars, basically it doesn't. And there are occasions where if it rains for 3 or 4 or 5 days straight and they can't load vessels through that period of time, there's 1 or 2 elevators out there that will actually start to back up and they don't have enough room to unload rail cars. That happens maybe 2 or 3 days a year. So rain on the West Coast, rain at the port really doesn't have an effect on the railways. It really has an effect on when they can load vessels. So there's a big difference. And that's one of the things that the people in our office on both sides of our operation just shake our heads at is when the railways start to complain about rain in Vancouver having an effect on the railway. We can't find any statistical proof that has a significant impact whatsoever. But that said, it does have an effect on loading things in Vancouver. And I think probably best to show it in pictures. That's the deck of under the old system, they used to throw tarps over top of the hold. And to do that, they have to put 3 or 4 people up there and they'd have to tie lines down and they'd be working in the wet. And there was a chance that you could slip and fall on top of these steel hatches. The longshoremen didn't like that. So they just said, we're not going to do it anymore. And that's when loading in the rain became a big issue. There's another picture of a tarped hold where these guys are trying to load a vessel through a small opening that the hatches broke open on the ship, and the longshoremen are trying to load in that configuration. That's another picture of a tarped hold. Well, they basically said that we're not going to do this anymore. Longshoremen said no. They went through a series of arbitrations and they finally decided, no, we're not going to do it like that anymore. So they've been looking for new ways of doing this, because we're not going to stop it from raining in Vancouver, so we've got to figure out a way around it. And what they've done is some vessels, probably about 20 or 30% of the vessels, come in with what they call cement holes. That's a cement hole. So they put this adapter at the end of the loading spout and they can put it into the cement hole and they can continue to load. But the problem is that you have to vent the dust that comes out of the hold, and that became problematic. So they came up with this, and a lot of the loading systems at the port have this sort of thing in there where they can put this into the cement hole, and this actually acts as a vacuum that pulls the dust out as they're loading. Makes it very efficient, very safe. You don't have to have people up on the hatch all the time monitoring what's happened. Tarps are gone. That's great. But it only works with vessels that have a cement hole. And there's, 70 or 80% of the vessels that come in, you have to load through open hatches. So what are they going to do? Oh, I put that picture up there because I've had people say, well, they should just build a great big hood over top of the vessel and cover it, and that'll solve it. But that's the terminal in Tacoma, Washington, and they thought that they could beat it by doing that. They spent $35 million on that structure, and on day one that they tried to use it, there was a slight wind, and the cover really doesn't help whatsoever. So basically building a cover over top of the ship doesn't help either. So they've come up with this idea. And that's a drawing of what they call an inflatable cover that would go over top of the break in the hatch that would be put on top of a vessel. And that's what it looks like. That's their test system. And this is a picture of a test that they did back in the fall, and it actually worked. And the longshoremen actually like it. And it weighs about 400 or 500 pounds, and they can pick it up. They can inflate it on the dock. They pick it up with the actual arm that they're using for loading. They put it over top of the hatch, keeps the water out, and they can continue to load that way. That's some of the solutions that they're coming up with for loading in the rain. But when rain intensity is really high, they don't even bother to try. They don't do it at all in Prince Rupert. They're not even talking about solutions up there. They just say there's no point because when it rains in Prince Rupert, it rains hard and it's always windy. So they don't see that that's a possibility. But in Vancouver, they believe that this type of system is going to work well. So I think that might answer the loading in the rain question.
Great answer. And I know that there are a few other questions that popped up along this. One of them was concerned about maybe focusing on north-south access, asking the question, is Rupert better than Vancouver, or are we better going to the Mississippi?
Interesting. The issue with Prince Rupert is it's only served by CN. There's only one grain terminal there, and it's owned by the three major grain companies, Cargill, Viterra, and Richardson. So they get the preference for whatever moves there. But the other problem with Prince Rupert is that there's a limited capacity on the railway that's up there. And it's not the track that's the problem, it's trying to get people to go to work up there. Um, the running trades crews, the maintenance crews and the like. So there's also other customers, and Prince Rupert has really been pushing growth up there. So you've got a big container terminal, you've got Alta Gas, you've got the lumber business up there that's been really growing. We had about a 3-year break where they really had to cut back on the amount of grain that went through Prince Rupert. This year, they've been trying to push as much as they possibly can. Right now, there's 7 vessels sitting in Vancouver or in Prince Rupert waiting to get loaded, and there just isn't enough grain being moved up there, despite so many of the grain companies trying to use it. So it's problematic. Now, insofar as the Mississippi is concerned, um, it's, all in all, you'd have to rail the product to some point on the Mississippi. There's been people who've tried it. Then you've got to get barge space. Then you've got to reload it at the other end. Trying to get terminal space down there is a problem. And then on top of that, trying to get ocean vessels to support the Mississippi at the other end. None of the Canadian grain companies have got facilities along the Mississippi, so they'd have to contract it with some other grain company who is going to say, yeah, well, we'll do it if we have capacity, but if we don't, you're going to have to wait. So it doesn't work out very well. It's more costly, more time consuming. Um, basically our markets predominantly are best served off the West Coast, the way it's structured today. And by the looks of it, that's the way it's going to be in the future, with the exception of China. And that's just for now. Who knows what they're going to do next week? That I don't see the Mississippi as being an alternative, nor is the Columbia River, by the way, in Washington, Oregon. So what we've got to make it work, and we have to make it work better.
Thank you for that, Mark. Next question. We often hear that balancing the corridors will help to alleviate service issues, but how do we get the railways to supply adequate services to the regions where our customers demand grain from, primarily the West Coast for our Asian markets?
Yeah, that whole balancing the corridors is a red herring in my opinion. We've done some very detailed analysis on trying to figure out if that could even possibly work, and we just keep coming to the conclusion that no, it won't. You create a routing for traffic from an origin to a destination based on the total logistics cost. And for instance, Japan and the Asia Pacific countries are the prime customer base, and trying to service that through Thunder Bay or Montreal or any place on the lower river makes absolutely no logistical sense. The cost benefit always comes back to moving it through the Vancouver corridor. Now, if you're in Manitoba, for instance, you probably can pencil out some economics that would make that work. But anything west of the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border, everything becomes questionable. And when you get to the western border, it becomes absolutely no question. So that's why Vancouver and Prince Rupert are seeing vessels that are actually going into the Mediterranean quite often. It's just cheaper to take it out of Vancouver, go through the Panama Canal, and then back across. That's the way the economics structures it. You can't change the directional flow of traffic based on railway convenience. So unless they're willing to make up the difference in the price or the cost of it by lowering their rail freight rates to make that work, it's never going to happen. And they probably have to cut their rates in half or more in order for the economics to pencil out on something like that. That's the analysis that we came up with.
Okay, I'm recognizing that we're into the last 5 minutes of the webinar, and if people are willing, we might go a few minutes over to answer a few of these questions. However, we won't be able to get through all of them, so we will take the questions offline and have Mark answer them, and then we can send them out with the recording afterwards. So please do keep the questions coming. Mark, the next question is, in your opinion, which area provides the biggest opportunity for Canada to realize its full potential as a major grain and other products exporter? Regulatory changes, including labor, physical infrastructure changes at port and in country, or technology infrastructure and data platforms, including export sales data?
I think it's a mix of both, to be honest with you. I think the first place to start is that having greater public displays of railway performance, for instance, excuse me, would, shame is a great motivator. If they can be shamed into performing better, that's a little bit. Some of it may have to come through some regulatory action, but I would be cautious about how I applied that, because if we've learned nothing in history, when you over-regulate, you basically don't create better performance, you create more resentment. So you have to be careful about how you do that. Insofar as infrastructure is concerned, there's still work that needs to be done. If not probably, it's highly unlikely, if not impossible, to come up with a third port on the West Coast. So what we've got is what we're going to have in the future. So we have to make that work better. And there are things that the Port of Vancouver is doing really well, just taking some time to get it done. One of the big issues is access to the North Shore. We've got some infrastructure in Vancouver that's over 100 years old. That needs to be replaced, and some of that is going to be fairly costly. I think probably the biggest benefit, though, that would come to the system would be greater resiliency and greater redundancy with the railways, having them to being a lot more nimble than they are today in responding to problems that occur, so that their recovery is, their recovery has got to be a lot better than what it has been, especially this year.
Okay, I'm going to ask 2 more questions and then we'll cut it off for the webinar. First question is, in regards to the removal of the consumer carbon tax, and in Saskatchewan, the removal of the entire carbon tax, how big of a factor is that in the way the MRE is calculated? How quickly will it be removed from it? And do we need to advocate for it to be removed immediately?
Well, it was removed immediately. The fuel tax was. And that will end up being reflected in the VRCPI that comes out perhaps this spring. They issue the VRCPI. They're probably working on it today. But in terms of the total cost, I would say that it's a fraction of a percent. The fuel cost, or I don't know, to be honest with you, exactly what the proportion of the total VRCPI is the fuel component, but the bigger components of that is the labor, the infrastructure costs. In terms of the greater portion of it, I don't think that's going to have a big effect on it.
Thank you for that. And last question. Mark, you talked a lot about us being disadvantaged geographically. In your mind, can we adapt or improve this? I think about the tunnels and the bridges at the West Coast. Again, rain in Vancouver. What about a third line to run empty cars back to the prairies? Could we see changes in the MRE that would go towards infrastructure funding instead of crop research? They say they're just kind of throwing some ideas out there, but wondering if you've put any thought into this.
There won't be, like I said, there won't be a third port on the West Coast. It's just 100 reasons I could give you why that's not going to happen, and most of them have to do with money. A lot of it has to do with geography, and that becomes problematic, especially when you're talking about a piece of track that runs between Vancouver and Kamloops. Part of the reason that CN and CP made their agreement for the joint section that runs between pretty much Kamloops and Vancouver is that there was an inability to build a third line or a second line on either side of the Fraser Canyon. So the only way that they could expand their capacity was by having unidirectional running. Basically, everything goes south on CN's track, everything goes north on CP's track. And that works. It's really expanded the capacity. It's when you get beyond that, it becomes a problem. So it's not a limitation on the track so much as it is a limitation when they get to the other end. And that's where the improvements at the Port of Vancouver has been putting in place really have a key place in this. There are a lot of things that are left to do. For instance, the new Westminster Bridge in Vancouver, which is over 100 years old, really needs to be replaced. And there's lots of studies that are going on, and I don't like to say that they're dithering, but there's a lot that they could do a lot faster. There's a few others that have been seemingly taking forever. Eventually, they may have to build a second bridge over to the North Shore if traffic increases that much. There are a lot of things that could be considered, and I think on the infrastructure side that's really important. But I think there's an old saying by an engineer that was around back in the 1950s and 60s, who is probably the father of doing statistical analysis, a fellow by the name of William Demings, and his saying was, "You cannot manage what you do not measure." And I think that's where the whole data side comes into play, and especially when you consider the advances that are being made in artificial intelligence. We in the logistics industry, especially in grain transportation, I don't think make enough use of that sort of tool. And I think investing money in that direction would tell us a lot about what we're doing wrong. But to have something like that, I think we've got the grain industry side working really well together. It's getting the railways to come on board. And there's another saying that I would put out there is the first step in solving a problem is admitting that you have one. And I don't know that we're there with our friends at the railway yet.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. We're going to wrap up the webinar. We appreciate your time and your expertise today. As always, it's a pleasure to have you. For everyone else who joined us, thank you. Today, we will have a recording of this webinar available on our website. And if you're interested in seeing any upcoming events, or if you'd like to sign up for our newsletter, you can always find that at saskwheat.ca. So stay tuned for more upcoming events and webinars. Again, Mark, thank you. And everyone, have a great day.
Thank you. Appreciate it.